Okay. Log on and see if we've got volume. Make sure that we're. Yep, sounds like we've got it, so that's good. All right, so last time we were talking about product safety issues and product development issues and the ethics involved in that. And we went from caveat emptor, and I said, you know, for most of human history, we could sort of judge whether or not goods and services were of marketable quality because they were fairly simplistic. They weren't terribly complex. Beginning in the Industrial Revolution, that all begins to change. Of course, you know, if we go back to the caveat emptor days, you know, with regard to food, a lot of people died because of food poisoning and things like that because they didn't understand microbes. So, you know, that was certainly an issue, and it was just kind of like you had to take care of yourself. Then we get to the Industrial Revolution, and we now come up with this theory that says if you manufacture products, you have a duty, right? And so you can use both deontological ethics and utilitarian ethics to justify negligence. You have a duty to manufacture products in a relatively safe fashion based on the best sort of science of the day. And the case I gave you and we talked about was diethylstilbestrol. Based on the best science of the day, nobody reasonably foresaw, and we talked about proximate cause, that generation later, these people would develop rare forms of cancer. It only really affected, it seemed like, the female offspring of these people who took the drug. And so under that theory, it wasn't reasonably foreseeable, and you could have an instance where people are harmed by a product and they're escaping liability because you took the reasonable and prudent care that is necessary to ensure that your product was safe based on the best science of the day. As a result of failures in that system, we get strict products liability. And strict products liability is purely a utilitarian perspective. It is purely utilitarian based. We're not saying we're imposing a duty now. You have that duty, it was imposed by negligence. We're saying if your product harms somebody, you are going to be strictly liable, and everyone in the chain is strictly liable in the chain of distribution for the harm that that product causes. Now, this is the one that business students like the least, because negligence seems fair. You have a duty to manufacture. You can't go about selling. And we talked about people marketing goods and things like that in the early part of the 20th century that were supposed to cure all sorts of things, and they may have been moonshine and harmful. And I think we can all see where that's not a good thing, right? I mean, you can't go around selling your hair tonic and claiming that it will do everything from growing hair to curing, you know, blindness and cancer and escape liability. That seems like a priori bad because you're manufacturing something and, you know, it's not tested, it's not proven, and that seems to be bad. Now, with strict products liability, what we're saying is that you do everything right and you're still strictly liable. I'll give you an example of this and why business students generally have a problem with it. There's a case called Ford versus Searcy. And Willie Searcy is riding in his father's Ford F-150 pickup truck in Texas, his stepfather's F-150 pickup truck in Texas. The F-150 is what? Anybody know?
The best-selling pickup.
It's
truck?
the, yep, you get a duck. It's the best-selling pickup truck. I mean, year over year, for like 30 years running, I think the Ford F-150 has been the best-selling pickup truck in the United States. He drops something on the floor and his stepdad tells him to pick it up. Now, you all have experienced this. You put on a seatbelt, and modern seatbelts have give to them, right? So that you can move around. And if something happens, if you yank on it quickly, it triggers a locking mechanism and stops particularly the shoulder belt from, from releasing and holds you in place. This is much better. When I was a kid growing up, lots of cars just had lap belts. And lap belts were wonderful for keeping you in place. But if you were involved in a collision, you could end up, cut in half as a result of the fact that the biggest part of your body was moving forward while the lower half was staying still. You could incur internal injuries if the crash was traumatic enough. And, if nothing else, you're probably going to get a pretty good case of, whiplash and other things as a result of the fact that your forward motion and then the jerking back is going to cause your head to fall forward and back and maybe cause traumatic injury to the spinal column. So they come up with this new thing, which is the shoulder belt that goes along with the seat belts. And now we've increased that to safety with, crush zones and also airbags in vehicles. So vehicles are, remarkably safer than they were when I was a kid growing up in the 1970s and 1980s. As Willie was bending forward to pick up what he had dropped on the floor to follow his stepdad's request, there was an accident. And in that split moment, because he was applying a constant pressure to the shoulder harness of the seatbelt, it didn't engage, and he smashed into the front windshield of the Ford F-150. The tension regulator didn't engage. He had multiple fractures and ended up being a quadriplegic as a result of that. And of course, they sued Ford under a strict products liability theory. Now, this is a product that was manufactured to be as safe as the science of the day would allow it. But who would have foreseen that a freak accident where somebody is told to pick something up off the floor would result in the tension regulator not engaging and causing injury to this child, right? And they, of course, sued Ford because who's got the deepest pockets to pay? Well, it's Ford. And using a strict products liability, the idea is, well, you manufactured this product, you made the profit off of it, and who's in the better position to take care of this kid who is now a quadriplegic, who has to have a breathing tube and an intubator to live? Is it the Searcy family or is it Ford? It's Ford. They're a $1 trillion a year company, and they're in the better position to pay. Now, the reason business students generally don't like this theory, the strict products, is that you've manufactured something. There is no such thing as absolutely 100% safe, is there? Nothing is 100% safe. Even the most ordinary of products can become unsafe if you misuse it, or in a freak accident like the one involving Willie Searcy, you can get these results where you're holding a company liable and they've done everything right. They have manufactured, we went from just having lap belts, as I described, to now we've got the shoulder belts We've also got airbags in vehicles, crush zones. I mean, if you wreck a vehicle today, when I was a kid growing up, again in the 1970s and 1980s, cars were made out of steel. They didn't have crush zones, and they would actually like rebuild. If you got in a wreck, they would take a hammer and pound it out and things like that. If you get in a wreck today, usually if the airbags are deployed, what happens to the car? It's totaled. That's it. That's the end of it. If you get in a wreck over about 20 miles an hour, the airbags deploy. All of the parts are manufactured in such a way as to like crumple, and it's just it's gone. And with aluminum frames and things like that, you can't pound them out and fix them. It's just done for, right? But they're a lot safer. Now you've done everything that you can to make this vehicle as safe as you possibly can, and you're still being held liable. It's strictly utilitarian because you're in the better position to pay than Willie Searcy's family. But what does that end up doing to the rest of us? Well, these products that you're using, when I got my first laptop, I was an undergraduate. I think I was a junior when my mom bought it for me, and it was wildly expensive. I think it cost something like close to $2,500, and this was in 1995. It weighed something like 12 pounds, I think, and it had a battery life, if you were using it without being plugged in, of about an hour or an hour and a half. What are these products now? I mean, because these products are not really all that, I mean, they are dangerous. You can become addicted to them, which is one of the reasons why they now tell you how much screen time you're using and things like that. But, what does that product weigh? Like pound and a half, 2 pounds? How long does the battery last? Hours and hours and hours without being plugged in. It will connect you to the web. That was not available on my first laptop. That was something that if you wanted to get into the World Wide Web, you had to have an actual connection. You had to plug it in to this thing that looked like a phone plug-in. And what does that product cost? Well, if you're buying a Mac, I see some of you have MacBooks in here. Those are fairly expensive. They're over $1,000. But if you figure out what $2,500 was in 1997, today that's going to be something like, I don't know, $7,500. And that's not what a MacBook costs today. And if you're using something other than a Mac, you can get a decent Windows book, box for less than $500. It's really, really cheap because nobody's suing these manufacturers for, like an inherently dangerous product. They're not causing death and destruction. However, so the price of those products has dramatically fallen from 1997 to today. We've seen a dramatic reduction in the price. And we've seen a corresponding increase in the technological capabilities of those products compared to what it would do in 1997. That's happened with lots and lots and lots of products. They've gotten a lot cheaper because we are able to mass produce them very efficiently and with very little risk. Your clothing is considerably cheaper today than it was in the past, right? And it's manufactured really, really quickly. That's not happened with automobiles. There was a study done that in the mid-2000s that suggested that if we had had similar reductions in price between automobiles and computing technology, a car should be able to, go on a gallon of gas for about 1,000 miles and cost, like $100. That's not what they do. They have gotten radically more fuel efficient. But if you have a combustion engine, it's nowhere near, 500 miles on a gallon of gas. Even if you have a hybrid, I think, you're looking at what are the best hybrids, probably getting 50 miles to the gallon, something like that. If you have a electronic vehicle, you're still, causing somewhat of a carbon footprint, because how do we manufacture electricity? Still largely through the burning of fossil fuels. My sister-in-law has a Tesla X, which is the SUV. It's so heavy that she had a flat tire coming up to visit me a couple weekends ago. I think I told you all this. And there's no spare tire in the Tesla because you can't change the tire, because it's so heavy that you can't jack it up yourself on the side of the road and change the tire. Her Tesla X is, I think, heavier than my Dodge Ram 3500. So we're still using a lot. And what is the price of an automobile? It's not gone down. It's gone up exponentially. Something like the average new car price amongst, if you took all models, is over $50,000, the average price of a car. It's why the average age of the automobile on the road in the United States has increased dramatically. It's now something like the average age of a car is 10 years old on the road today. Now, admittedly, they'll go a lot longer, but we're paying a lot more, and it's as a result of strict products liability, because you have Ford being held responsible to the tune of millions and millions of dollars. They calculated that what it would cost to maintain Willie Searcy in basically a nursing type care facility for his entire life was, at the time that the accident occurred, something like $27 million. And then, of course, there were punitive damages awarded. Now, when we use, and the theory that lawyers use to justify, and I'm a lawyer, I like, and I generally like strict products liability, but when we talk about utilitarianism as it relates to strict products liability, how much pain are we all in as a result of the lawsuits that car manufacturers have from automobile wrecks, where if somebody's injured, they're going to sue the manufacturer and say, well, you weren't quite safe enough. If there's any kind of design defect or manufacturing flaw, there's two things that can trigger strict products liability. Design defect, which I would argue is actually not strict products liability, is actually negligence. Because what you're saying in a design defect is that there would be a safer theoretical design possible, or manufacturing defect. What happens when you have a manufacturing defect? Well, it's just a result of the manufacturing process, that something goes wrong. As cars are manufactured and they come off the line, historically speaking, this is not necessarily true today, but because they were made of steel, largely, they were stamped dies that were making the parts, right? And as that die stamps more and more parts, it becomes worn, and the parts don't fit together quite like they did when the first one rolls off. So you can get a defect in that, right? Just from the natural manufacturing process. or you can get a design defect, which you're saying basically, and this is the case in Ford versus Cersei, you're saying, look, the tension regulators should be able to tell between a constant pressure and then a sudden acceleration. Whereas the old tension regulators, and they do now, only catch if there's a sudden acceleration. If there's a constant pressure being applied and then you apply more pressure, it didn't catch. But what's the alternative? When we think about this from an ethical standpoint, well, the alternative is to say to a child who's been tragically injured as a result of a product, I'm sorry, it just sucks to be you, but you're probably going to die. That seems really harsh, doesn't it? Now, the reality is with everything, I mean, there are risks. It's the reason why drugs now, we talked about DES when we began, it's why drugs now cost, a lot of money to produce and bring to market because of strict products liability. And it's why the warning labels on those drugs are, printed in small fine print that are pages and pages and pages long. And you still have liability. If somebody has a reaction to a drug, they're probably going to sue the drug manufacturer, and under the theory of strict products liability, they're going to win. Yes.
If you sued a company for strict products liability, how would they usually combat that? Like just evidence that their product is safe? Is that all they can really do?
Well, I mean, those cases almost never get to trials. Ford versus Cersei actually did get to trial because they pushed it to trial. And then he actually, the end of that is kind of tragic. Ford appealed, and during the pendency of the appeals process, he actually died because the safety net that was put together, cobbled together by his parents to try and keep him alive, which relied on a series of volunteers and family members to basically, maintain
Around the clock.
the breathing apparatus around the clock, gave way at one point in time. One of his healthcare workers that they actually were paying got off shift. She took a phone call and forgot to reconnect the intubator, and he died, kind of tragically. Those cases generally don't get to trial. I mean, that was an unusual case. Most of the time, those cases are settled, right, out of court for millions of dollars. From time to time, they actually do get to trial in class actions. You'll see this particularly with drug manufacturing. They will push it to trial, and you'll have a class action, and then every member of the class gets a notice that they can participate or opt out of that. Again, usually the closer you get to the courthouse steps, the more you're, sort of pushed to negotiate and come to a settlement. When the COVID vaccines first came out, for example, I went to get my vaccine at the height of the pandemic with my law partner who was immune compromised because he was, over 60 and had high blood pressure and was a little bit overweight, probably pre-diabetic. And we're sitting there. They did it at the fairgrounds when we went, and we're sitting there, and two people were, like that in this huge audit room full of people, two people had a negative reaction that I witnessed. And I thought about like videoing it because it was actually sort of, frightening. But then I thought, if you do that and you put it out there, more and more people are not going to go get the shot. They probably need to get the shot, right? I mean, that's the reality, is that a certain number of people are going to have an adverse reaction. And that's why drugs are so expensive, because they have to plan for, over the life of that product, how many people are going to, have issues with the product. And what it ends up being is that the cost is borne by everybody. Now, how do you calculate, if you're using a utilitarian principle, how do you calculate what is the overall greatest happiness? It's really difficult to do. I think on the whole, by and large, though, products liability does lead to, we now have much safer products than we did even 20 or 30 years ago as a result of that. Pricing issues, generally speaking, we are a capitalist society and we rely on free market principles. But problems occur with pricing when you have externalities as a result of some things. There are some things that we can't price, right? There are some things that we cannot put a dollar value on and that the market fails in. Things like clean air, clean water. How do you put a price on that? How do you make sure that environmental safety concerns are met when you can have a tragedy of the commons kind of situation? So the tragedy of the commons comes from a historic, analogy where it used to be that lots of communities, and in fact, even to this day, you can see a remnant of this in Central Park. They had a sheep meadow where anybody could take their sheep and put them out on the meadow and graze. And what happens to the meadow eventually? Sheep are kind of like goats. Anybody ever, again, most people have not been raised on a farm. We had goats and sheep on our ranch, mostly just for my brother and I. That's not what we raised, but my mother thought that they were entertaining, and they were. They'll denude the land if you put them on too small a parcel. They will eat everything, particularly goats. They'll eat the bark off of trees, and you'll be left with nothing. So there's this sheep meadow. It's part of Central Park now in New York City, and everybody, of course, puts their sheep there, and you have the incentive to put one more sheep on the property to the point that it destroys it for everybody, right? This is called the tragedy of the commons. And how do you deal with that in terms of how do we put prices on that? How do we, in a capitalist society, take care of these externalities? Other issues, if we had a completely capitalistic society, we wouldn't allow for, or we would allow for monopolistic pricing. If you could put your competitors out of business, that would be fine. If we had a truly 100% capitalist system, but we have things called, like government regulation that prohibits monopolies from forming. If you get too much of the market, you're broken up under the Sherman Antitrust Act because you're anti-competitive. What about if you have just a small number of firms and price fixing? That's also illegal. Now, it's harder to prove, but it's not allowed. And if we had a purely 100% capitalist system, you could do that if you had a small number of firms. So when my brother was going to school at OSU, this was before I think OnCue became really big. There were two guys who own most of the gas stations in Stillwater. Stillwater is off by itself. It's not like Norman, which is sort of part of the Metroplex. If you go up there, it's got, kind of a unique campus culture there. It's a fairly big party school, but it's not close to I-35. It's about, 15 miles off of I-35. And there's only one gas station out there at I-35, so it's not like you have a lot. And so these two people's gas prices in Stillwater were always higher than they were elsewhere in the state because they had a captive market and a limited number of suppliers. And it's hard to prove, but it's illegal. to fixed prices. Price gouging occurs when you take advantage of things like natural disasters, which we also prohibit. Again, if we had a 100% capitalist society, that would be called good business. It's illegal under most state laws. So if there's a hurricane, for example, that goes through Florida, you can't start charging exorbitant amounts for things like plywood, sandbags, gasoline. Now, what does that result in? What's the opposite? What's the downside of not allowing for price gouging?
People buy up all the.
It means that you have a shortage. Yeah, you can get a duck. It means that you can end up with shortages because if you're paying market price for plywood and for gasoline, as everybody starts to leave the area, what do? They go fill up their car, they buy the plywood to deal with their windows, and you run out. Which may mean that, higher value properties where people would be willing to pay more may sustain more damage than others. Unlikely, but in theory, you could have it. Predatory pricing occurs when you target vulnerable populations. And an example of this is the subprime mortgage industry. In the mid-2000s, they deregulated the mortgage industry. So it used to be that you had to have a fully documented loan in order to get a home mortgage. And there were pretty strict formulas as to what you could afford in terms of your house price. And I think they estimated that you could have something like about 2.5 times your gross income was what you could afford in terms of the property that you could purchase. When they opened it up and Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae sort of stopped requiring fully documented loans. Now, what was a fully documented loan? It meant that if you wanted to buy a mortgage, if you wanted to get a mortgage on a home, if you wanted to buy a home and get a mortgage, you had to list all of your income, and that was then verified. So the mortgage lenders would actually go to your employer and not only verify that you currently made what you said you made, but that you were likely to continue in that employment for a long period of time. Now, that's pretty easy for someone like me because I work for the state of Oklahoma. I have a reasonable expectation of continued employment as a state employee. And on top of that, I have tenure, which means that I really have, the state of Oklahoma, the courts have said that tenure is like a property right in my job. But most people switch jobs, don't they? So how do you know? And we have employment at will. So they would look at things like the length of time that you had been with an employer. And historically, these were long-term relationships. That's no longer the case in this contemporary era. Job hopping, particularly as the labor market has gotten tighter, is more and more frequent. I'm really unusual in that I have worked for the University of Central Oklahoma pretty much, with one exception when I went to get a PhD, since I was 22 years old. Most of you will not work when you get your first job, you're probably going to stay 3 to 5 years. And then you'll get a better job, right? So this has now become the norm. Well, they started using stated income and non-verified income on home mortgage applications. This meant that a lot of people were inflating their income and that the mortgage industry was becoming less sensitive to, what people could afford. And they were doing things like adjustable rate mortgages, which would start out with a low interest rate and then have it, increase. And as long as you could refinance or sell, what people were doing, I mean, again, people now, on average, I think the average home sells every 5 years in the United States. That's not the case if you went back in time. If you went back in time to when my grandparents bought their home, they paid cash for it, and they lived there until my grandfather died and my grandmother sold it. Nobody does that. You start out, you buy a starter home, and then you get rid of that home and you buy a bigger home because you now have children and you have more stuff, and we don't ever get rid of our stuff. We just buy more stuff and we build monuments to our stuff. It's called our homes that we fill with our stuff. Have you ever noticed that somebody else's stuff is crap? Move your crap so I can put my stuff here. And we don't ever get rid of it. We just buy a bigger home. So we're flipping homes, and as long as the real estate market goes up, that was okay. When there was a fall in the real estate value prices and a dip in the home market, a lot of those people were upside down in their homes. They couldn't sell them. And as their adjustable rate mortgage increased, they could no longer afford the mortgage payments. These had a rippling effect because those debt obligations were packaged together and sold as collateralized debt obligation, and they were a type of financial investment that people could make. And it led to massive disruption in the financial sector as these people started, losing their homes because they could no longer afford the mortgage, and they couldn't refinance because they were now upside down in their house, and their house prices had fallen. That's predatory pricing. When you target vulnerable populations and you basically, everybody, it's part of the American dream. When I used to teach American national government, I would have students write a paper called My American Dream, and it was amazing how many of those American dreams were similar. Everybody in America, this is not typical everywhere else, by the way, that everybody wants to own a home. In most other countries where land is scarce and density population is higher, the idea of home ownership is not a reality. And it's not necessarily encouraged through the tax code like it has been in the United States, through the ability to deduct home mortgage interest. Now, it's interesting that as the standard deduction has increased and that's no longer applicable to a lot of people, we still have this desire to own our home because it's just part of the American psyche that you want to own your own little piece of dirt and your home and have that, investment that we don't see necessarily in other places. And it led to this big, huge market failure because people were targeted with the idea of, well, you'll get this loan and you'll get out of the loan in enough time, you'll lock in a rate, property values will continue to go up, and hopefully you'll get a better job, or your circumstances will improve. And it was sort of a perfect storm of events that led to a huge crisis. Again, when we use utilitarian theory to think about this, initially, one of the reasons that they did the deregulation was on a theoretical basis of utilitarianism, that most people want to own a home, and we're increasing the ability of the average American to be able to purchase that home. You didn't have to be like my grandparents who could afford to write the check. I mean, they just wrote a check for their home, right? And the home that my mother grew up in, they had saved enough money to just be able to buy the house. Now, the average house price in that day and age was a lot less than it is today. What is the average home price in Edmond? It's close to $450,000. The average home price across the state of Oklahoma is something like $275,000. And so, I mean, home prices have gone up considerably over the course of, the last 50 years. And home ownership is one of the things that we look at. How do you calculate the value or the happiness or dishappiness that's created when you have this market failure? And that is reasonably foreseeable. Unlike DES, a lot of the market failures that occurred in the subprime mortgage industry were reasonably foreseeable because housing markets have failed in the past. There have been bubbles in the past that have led to similar results. Any questions about products and pricing? Let's talk about promotion and advertising and place. This is the part of marketing that everybody thinks of as being marketing. A lot of people don't think of product development as being part of marketing, but it is. And a lot of people don't think of logistics, which we'll talk about in a minute, as being part of marketing, but it is. But clearly promotion is, when we think about ethics and marketing issues, this is the one that comes to mind most of all. Advertising. We're the only nation, we're one of only 2 nations on earth that allows for direct to consumer advertising of pharmaceutical products. In most other countries, you can't advertise medicine to consumers. Now, what has this led to in the United States? Well, there's a good side and a bad side to this. The good side is that I think a lot of things that we used to think of as being abnormal have been normalized. So I told you all that my father was an FBI agent. He was a special agent in charge of the Santa Fe field office in New Mexico. After he retired, he continued to work for the Bureau as a special investigator, doing background investigations on scientists at Los Alamos and Sandia National Labs. When he went into the Bureau, he went in under J. Edgar Hoover. At that time, everyone had to meet the director. And if you had ever been seen, now, mind you, the Bureau would send you to see a psychiatrist, but if you had ever been seen by a psychiatrist or psychologist on your own, you were barred from employment in the Bureau. Because you were viewed as, and you're looking at me with these puzzled looks, in the 1950s and 60s, that was a sign that you were crazy. That's what people thought. If you went to see somebody about your problems, you were obviously insane. Or at least that was what the Bureau thought. So you couldn't get a job. And there was a stigma during that time period associated with people who went to see therapists. As a result of direct-to-consumer advertising of things like, I don't know, Prozac, we have less of a stigma today about that. Most people recognize that mental health is not necessarily bad behavior. That's what people in the past, why can't you behave, like if a kid had lots of disruptive behavior in a classroom, it used to be that, they got a whack upside the head with a ruler or something like that, and told to sit down and shut up. And there wasn't much of a recognition that maybe this was sort of beyond their control as a result of having things like ADD or ADHD. And depression was also, the attitude in the 1950s, I think in 60s, was if you're depressed, there's something wrong with you. There is now, as a result of direct consumer advertising, things like Prozac, Wellbutrin, Zoloft, things like that, we have a recognition that these are caused by factors that may be beyond somebody's control. Now, the downside to that is that what we have is we have a society that now thinks that you can solve everything with a pill. Right? I mean, just go get a pill. If you are, having difficulty controlling your weight, just go get on semaglutide, which is, Ozempic, or one of the shots of semaglutide. Well, I don't know, maybe we shouldn't just think that there's a pill that's going to solve every problem. When I was in my 20s, I could eat whatever I wanted and not gain weight and not have problems. At 51, if I eat everything that I want to, I not only, can't maintain my weight. When I got married, first time, I was 149 pounds. I'm no longer 149 pounds. And I could eat anything and never gain weight, I weigh about 200 pounds now. So about 50 pounds over the course of, 25 years. And if I eat everything that I want, there are lots of bad consequences to that. I can eat everything that I want and my stomach is fine. I think there needs to be a recognition that you can't just take a pill. Now, if I eat everything I want, you have lots of, heartburn issues and things like that occur that you just can't do when you're 50 as opposed to when you were 25. And I don't know that there's a pill for everything, that we can solve everything with a pill. The good side is that we recognize that a lot of things are not people's fault and that they're not abnormal. But the bad side is that we have a tendency to think that everything can be solved by just taking a pill. And maybe it can't. There are things, you damage your body irretrievably, and there are things that you're maybe not going to recover from. And that a pill is not going to solve everything. These kinds of issues bring up huge problems with autonomy. So let's look at an ad. Let's see if I can find it. Switch to the screen. We looked at this before. That's the second ad. She did a first ad years ago. They didn't tell you in this ad that she had pancreatic cancer. In the first ad, she says, my doctor told me I had pancreatic cancer. And I said, well, what are we going to do? And he said, well, Peggy, you're gonna die. And then she goes on to say, and then I found Cancer Treatment Centers of America. And I was saved. Peggy ended up dying, by the way. You don't survive pancreatic cancer generally. There are very few people that survive it. It's almost always fatal. There are sort of two types. There's one type that can go into remission, which is what happened with hers for some period of time, but it generally comes back. And one of my cousins is actually a pancreatic cancer researcher, and he thought when he went into the field something like 30 years ago that he would be one of the ones. He has a PhD and an MD, he's a MUDFUD, that he would be one of the ones. He's at the University of Texas at Austin to solve this. And there have not been great strides made in pancreatic cancer. It's one of the ones that it's almost always fatal. In other countries, you couldn't have ads like that. Why? Because you're targeting a vulnerable population. If you have, and by the way, CTCA I think has gone broke. If you have advanced stage cancer, I would suggest to you that like CTCA, the ads make you feel really good. Like that's a great ad. We've watched the Herding Cats commercial in here, didn't we?
Yes.
Right, we watched that. That was not necessarily a great ad. It's a funny ad. It's a memorable ad. It does one of the things that great ads should do, but it fails to do the second part. So great ads engage the mind of the consumer and they deliver a selling message. The Herding Cats commercial engaged the mind of the consumer, absolutely. If you all remember that ad when I showed it to you, it's funny. It uses humor. Nobody remembers what the company was, so it fails on the second. The reason I show the CTCA ad, the Peggy ad, is that I think it does both. It engages the mind of the consumer. We have this sort of mythology in the United States around the American West, which you saw in the Herding Cats commercial, and you also see it in the CTCA ad with the horse and the mountains and being out in a bucolic setting and riding off into the sunset, and isn't that all wonderful? So it engages the mind of the consumer. It's talking about cancer, but it's telling you the happy ending of this, which is that, you know, Peggy went into CTCA and she wasn't able to probably, give her horse a drink of water and ride off into the sunset. And now she is. And it tells a compelling story. The problem with ads like this is they affect issues of autonomy. So when we think about what we're doing as marketers, we have to tell a compelling story, but we have to ask ourselves, is the will overborne? Now, the text says, your textbook says, and I think it's wrong, that autonomy is not something you have 1 minute and not the next. And I don't think that's true. I think you can be a rational, comprehensive person. Now, a lot of people will say things like, you just need to rely on good old-fashioned common sense. There's no such thing as common sense. There's either rational, comprehensive thought, or there's magical thinking. Right? No such thing as common sense. I wish people wouldn't use that word because it doesn't exist. There's rational, comprehensive thought where you engage a problem from a logical perspective, and then there's not. It's one or the other. And what do I mean that you can engage in rational, comprehensive thought and be autonomous in one situation and not another? Well, from personal experience, my mother was a very shrewd businesswoman. And up until the end, she died of cancer. Up until the end, she was running her business up until the very last month. And she was making rational decisions. But when you are dealing with, pain and things like that in your medical choices, I'm not sure you're now making rational decisions. Does that make sense? I think you can make rational business decisions as a business person. You can decide, for example, that your business needs to purchase a piece of equipment, and if you're undergoing cancer treatment, not necessarily make rational choices, make autonomous decisions with regard to that aspect of your life. I think your autonomy can be violated because you were so overcome with emotion. And CTCA they did this. They had these fantastic ads. Not very good results, but fantastic ads. You can't apply characteristics of the individual to the aggregate. Right? So you're taking one person who seems to have had this miraculous result and saying, if you come here, now at the end, they say treatments may vary and everyone's unique and we don't guarantee results. But that's not what people hear when they're terrified and afraid and they've been diagnosed with cancer, right? They look for hope. And you can overbear the will. So to make an autonomous decision, you need a couple of things. One, the decision has to be knowing. This is a very little bar, a very low bar. What's knowing? You're awake when you sign the consent form. When you go into the hospital, they're going to ask you to sign a consent form. They don't give you much time to read it. If you did, you probably wouldn't sign it. I'm a lawyer. I had surgery. And, I had a panic attack as they're asking me to sign this consent form, which is pages and pages long. That basically says, you could die. And I had this panic attack because I had killed one of my employees over something like this. And all of a sudden I had my life flash before my eyes when I went in for surgery. So I had this employee and he was the most annoying employee on the planet. He would come in, he was extremely OCD. It would take him, I would sit there and watch from my office window, him coming into the parking lot every day. He would get here literally at 6:45 and it would take him an hour and 15 minutes to get from his car into the office because he would stop and check. If you're OCD, he would get halfway across the parking lot and think he'd forgotten something and he'd go through his whole briefcase. Then you'd think he'd forgot to lock the car, so he'd go check all the doors and check the trunk. So he was going to have he had this minor issue that was happening to him, and he needed a minor surgery. He had this thing, your inner ear is what maintains your equilibrium, which is why when you're flying, right, you have to clear your ears, get lightheaded, things like that, because the inner ear is what tells you that you're on balance, right? So he had this little growth on the eustachian tube of his inner ear, and they were going to remove that growth. And it got to the point where he was having to come in at 6 because all of a sudden, not only was he having to check, but he would fall over in the parking lot and stumble and couldn't get around. So about 2 months before his surgery, he comes in and he's like, I need to take off some time. And I said, okay, and no problem. He never took off anything. and I said, that's fine. I'll tell you a story about Steve. I won't tell you his name. He wanted to inventory all the cups at the field house here at UCO. And he did this inventory and he found out that there was missing between the drawer and the cups. And I said, yeah, what do you want me to do about that? And he's like, well, we need to fire the people who are manning the concessions. I'm like, you know that the sororities and fraternities man the concessions as volunteers? And he said, yes, and I think they're giving their friends free Cokes. And I'm like, you think? Yeah, I mean, how much time have we wasted talking about this issue over what amounted to, like a de minimis amount of money, really? So that's fine. Then every day he would come in and he would tell me how worried he was and how he was talking to his priest and how he was confessing and all of these things. And finally, after about like 2 weeks of him coming into my office every day and telling me about his anxiety over going, I said, Steve, like, you're gonna be fine. Like, people go into surgery all the time. This is not a third world country. This is like a 15-minute procedure. It's not a big deal. Well, he went and had the procedure, and at 30 seconds into the procedure, he had a negative reaction to the anesthesia and he died. So I killed Steve, right? And then I had to go to his funeral, and I'm thinking, like I was much younger than him. I was in my 20s, he was in his 50s. And I'm thinking he probably told his wife that I told him to suck it up and go have the surgery. And, now like Mrs. Steve is gonna blame me. So like I'm like very concerned at the funeral. I'm like sweating bullets, the nervous sweats that you get, right? So, life goes on, and I'm not thinking. And then I broke my hip. And all of a sudden I'm in the hospital and they're giving me these consent forms and talking about anesthesia. And like, all of a sudden the ghost of Steve comes back to me and I'm like, I'm gonna die. Like, karma is gonna come back and bite me big time on this, right? And I'm gonna pass away. And so you're sitting there and I break out in this like cold sweat again over this. And I'm really seriously considering, not signing the forms, but you're in enormous pain when you've broken a hip. They're gonna have to do something to it, or you'll be in a wheelchair, right? I mean, that's just the reality. And so you sign away the consent, and you're not necessarily making an autonomous decision. I mean, yes, it's knowing. My point is that, yeah, it's knowing you're conscious. They're not asking you to sign when you're not awake. They're not bringing it in after they've given you the anesthesia, right? That's a very low bar. The second bar is it voluntary? Now you can know something and it not be voluntary. When I used to teach criminal law and procedure, there were these cases that involved prisoners whose confessions had been beaten out of them. There used to be these heavy things called phone books that were available in most communities. And, like, they would take these phone books and they would get a prisoner into a room and they would say, you did it, right? And when the prisoner would say no, they would whap him upside the head with a phone book. Why? Doesn't leave a mark. Doesn't leave a bruise. After you've been hit upside the head a few times with the phone book, you might confess. You're knowing, you know it, right? You're conscious, you're awake, but it's not voluntary. Again, this prong of the test is pretty easy. Knowing, voluntary, pretty easy to determine. Like, nobody, the doctor isn't standing there with a gun saying your brains or your signature are going to be on this consent form. If you don't consent, they don't care. They're going to go do another. They're going to go on to their next surgery, right? I mean, they're not like we're gonna strap you down and shoot you full of Thorazine until you consent. They're not overbearing the will with in terms of voluntary. The third prong is the hardest. It's intelligent. Is it intelligent? This is the hard prong to meet. When you see ads like the CTCA ad, again, and this is why I think you could be autonomous in one situation, you can make rational, calculated business decisions. My mother was making rational, calculated business decisions up until about a month before she died. She was running her business. They would come to the hospital and she would talk to her secretary and she would make these decisions. But with regard to her medical stuff, I'm not sure that it was intelligent because you're so overwhelmed with emotion that I don't know that you can weigh the alternatives in a cold and calculating fashion. If you see the ad for CTCA, it's knowing you're awake. It's voluntary. They're not forcing you to watch the ad. You can turn the ad. But is it intelligent? They're playing on your emotions. If you've just been diagnosed with cancer, you're probably pretty vulnerable and susceptible to emotional appeals that may not be rational. It's the same reason that we have problems with how many of you like not the CTCA, the ASPCA ads that come on that had Sarah McLachlan playing, and she was actually one of the spokesmen for ASPCA. And they show you animals in cages, and then they're playing Sarah McLachlan's The Arms of the Angel. Do you know what that song's about? It sounds good in the background for the animals. It's in the arms of the angel. It's about a drummer who overdosed of heroin in a hotel room. It's about drug use. This is one of my hobbies, is to figure out which songs are really subversively about drug use. She says that she talks about how she wrote it after the death of this drummer that she'd heard about, because being on the road can be lonely, and she could understand how you could become a substance abuser. The Hotel California by the Eagles, how many of you have heard that song? Also about drug use, right? It's pretty obvious in that one. You can check out, but you can never leave. They stab it with their steely knives, but you still can't kill the beast. It's the needles that people use to inject drugs, still can't kill the beast. But it sounds good. And there's, these dogs and are you making it intelligent? Well, I think one of the things that you want to know is the ASPCA actually using the money? If they're giving you this advertisement, what percentage of your money is actually going towards overhead and what percent is actually going? And you don't know that, right? It's an emotional decision, and they know. I mean, it is a powerful commercial when you see it. It's enormously powerful. And so we have to think about these things when we make commercials and the products that we're talking about. With regard to logistics, this is again part of the thing that we don't think about. And it's one of the ones where a lot of people don't think that there are ethical issues, because it just seems like logistics is the place. It's how we get things from one place to another in the most efficient manner. Historically speaking, the power in the channel, so you didn't buy Fords by going to Detroit. Historically, you bought Fords for a dealership. How did the dealer get them? Well, through middlemen who transport the cars on trucks and rail and boats and things like that to the dealerships. And who has all of the power in the channel? Historically, it was the manufacturer, because they set the initial price, right? Walmart actually reversed that trend because Walmart could buy so much, they could go to manufacturers and tell them what their price was going to be that they were going to pay if they wanted to sell to Walmart. That's enormous amounts of power. It totally disrupted the power structure in the supply chain. Historically, manufacturers had the power because they set the initial price, and then everybody added to that their costs associated plus a markup when moving those goods through the channel. All of a sudden, Walmart becomes this huge behemoth. They were at one time, until Amazon has probably overtaken them, the largest seller of textiles, soap, shampoo, laundry detergents, food, clothing in the world. Diamonds, they were the largest seller of diamonds at one point in time. More people bought diamonds from Walmart than, and Sam's than anybody else. And they set the price. That meant that they had enormous power over manufacturers because everybody wanted to be in Walmart. There's a whole article entitled "The Man Who Said No to Walmart," which was a lawnmower manufacturer. I think it was Snapper, because they wouldn't sell the price point that Walmart wants to sell a lawnmower at that point in time was $100. That's what their customer would pay. Well, but what do you get when you get a $100 lawnmower? You get a lawnmower that'll last a season, maybe, or less, or maybe two if you're lucky, and you treat it really, really well. But what was the average Walmart person? They were buying it for the season, and then when it wouldn't start, they'd go buy another one, right? That wasn't what Snapper manufactured. They manufactured quality products, and they couldn't sell it for that price point. There was a follow-up article that says they finally came around and sold, to Walmart, because Walmart had such a huge. Now, this doesn't seem like it would be a huge issue, but it is in terms of ethics. All of a sudden, you're now affecting the ability of manufacturers to set their price and thus to pay their employees. Walmart largely subsidizes their business off of the back of American consumers and their taxes, because the average Walmart employee is eligible for Medicaid. What does that mean? They're not providing health care, or if they do, they had lots of employees until the Affordable Health Care Act. They were maintaining mostly a part-time workforce, and so they didn't have to provide them with health benefits until the Affordable Care Act came along, and then they have skinny plans. So what happens with these people when they get hurt or they get injured? Well, they do what? They go to the ER. They can't afford it. They have Medicaid. Who ultimately is paying for that? We are. And if you start influencing manufacturers because you're setting their price point, all of a sudden your business practices may be picked up in a need to cut costs by the manufacturer on their business practices, right? So again, it's an ethical issue. Targeting vulnerable populations also. Placing items in positions where people are likely to have to consume them, or their will be overborne. There are food deserts. And so we place a lot of, in these food deserts, a lot of goods that are not necessarily healthy. They're cheap, they're easy to manufacture, they're largely made out of corn, and they're not good for you. But what is somebody who has to ride a bus? If you are poor in Oklahoma City and you have no car, no transportation, or you have unreliable car, where are you going to go shop? Well, usually convenience stores that have processed food, heavily processed food. If it's between starvation and eating heavily processed food, we're targeting vulnerable populations with junk food. I've enjoyed this class. I hope you have as well. I graded your third exams, and I put comments on there. I have to say that the overall, there was a lot better attempts this time around. If you have questions, you're welcome to text me, come by my office. We will not have class next week because that's finals week, so there's no regularly scheduled class. The fourth exam is open, and it's the same as, the other three. So if you have questions, be sure and call or text me. I'd be happy to FaceTime with you if I'm not available on campus, whatever you need to help you get the best score that you can get on the fourth exam. And if you have questions about the third, please feel free to reach out. I'll stick around if you have some questions, and I'll be in my office as well this afternoon. So just let me know. Thanks.
I have a question.
Hold on, let me stop the video and